Yeah, welcome everyone. Today I have Ozan, CEO of Edge Delta. I will have him introduce and then we can get started. Go ahead, Ozan.
Perfect. Hello, nice to meet you. My name is Ozan. I'm the founder and CEO of Edge Delta. We are a telemetry pipeline product. We believe it all starts with pipelines. Pramada, you and I chatted a little bit about pipelines the other day on LinkedIn, and I'm excited to have this chat.
Great. So let's just dive into it, right? Yeah. So to be honest, I think for a while because I looked at the previous generation telemetry pipelines, and there was a company that eventually Splunk acquired it, for assets. It didn't go really well. So when Cribble came along, I was still very skeptic, and then when Splunk sued them, I was again more skeptic, like if this is going to work. But for whatever reason, like thankfully the lawsuit got settled, and I know they have raised to like a pretty healthy run rate right now. And we were discussing on LinkedIn about this. So would love to just get your view on this thing. So to me, I think before Cribble and before Edge Delta, it was Splunk was the gatekeeper, and it picked up all of the data, and you couldn't drop the data, so you paid the Splunk tariff, right? But now we have an option where we don't have to pay the Splunk tariff. We can have you guys and Cribble pick up the data, put it in low cost storage, and then you can figure out whether you want to put it back into Splunk or Datadog and others. So would love to hear from you, like when you started the company, what was your vision and how that vision has changed, if anything?
Yeah, so when I came up with the idea, I was actually at Sumo Logic at the time, and started to think about this idea, and really got passionate about it, and left Sumo Logic. I think at the time, whether it's Sumo Logic or Elastic or Splunk or even Datadog, there was some very basic capabilities to do this effectively at, I would call it almost like an internal pipeline level, right? So Splunk has forwarders, Sumo Logic has what they call collectors, which was effectively the same thing. There was CollectD, there was FluentD, there was FileBeats, Logstash, all sorts of various ways to move this data around, but it wasn't really thought of as anything substantial. So if we look at, let's say, 6 or 7 years ago, even Datadog, for instance, had this concept of, ingest versus indexing, right? Right when they really started to kind of put a lot of emphasis and, I would say, focus on that part of their architecture as options for their customers. So I think, when we look at it today, you look at the options, and you mentioned Cribble, right? I think Cribble to me is very similar to, let's say, filtering something out of Kafka, or in the Datadog case, right? Ingesting something, but not necessarily indexing it, right? And I think that was a very healthy half step in the right direction. I think, frankly, what Edge Delta is doing is a lot more like 3 steps into the future. And I think for 3 steps in the future, you have to get a lot closer to where that data is created. So, we do support Edge. We also support Stream. But in the case of, let's say, network data or Kubernetes or whatever else, you might not want to stream those terabytes and petabytes of data to an endpoint akin to something like Kafka before you decide to drop that data, right? So I think for Edge Delta, we have a lot more of a cohesive, fuller idea and picture on the industry. And for us, we are trying to get very close to where that data is created, to really have that extremely scalable and efficient approach to your overall observability observability and security data sets. So that's kind of our view and how it's different.
Go ahead. So let's talk about the edge, right? So in some sense, they were this edge guys, like I call XDR as like the last generation edge, right? So they were collecting the agents, the alerts on whether it's a network or an endpoint, and analyzing. So can you talk a bit about difference between like how you guys approach edge versus an XDR use case?
Yeah, I think XDR, primarily more on the security side, is a very great technology, very great concept. I think for us, we've always been pitching both, right? Despite the fact that our name is Edge Delta and that's our differentiation, we've never said you shouldn't correlate, right? I think if you look at Splunk and you look at common information models and correlation and joins and all sorts of threat feeds and enrichment and all the intelligence that you can get with making sure that you're correlating all that data set, I think we've always been pitching both. So you should be doing some things on the edge. You should be doing something centrally. And we've always basically pitched that you should be doing the appropriate processes at the appropriate areas. And for us, when you look at the architecture itself, there's some very obvious things that you should be doing on the edge, right? Like for instance, if you're going to filter out a specific data set, or you're going to mask something, or you're going to hash something, or you're going to, let's say, even cut out a part of a log message, to us, logically, that totally makes sense that you want to be doing that as far upstream as possible, because if you think about it, every single one of those processes is a hop, and it's disk, it's memory, it's compute. It is certain inefficiency that you're using on data that you don't care about, right? And the other part of it that's interesting is we've never said you shouldn't be looking at certain data sets. For instance, there's great options out there for object storage, whether it's AWS S3 or blob storage or GCS. And we do believe that you should have a copy of most or all of your data in object storage to be able to use for instance, security investigations, audit, compliance, et cetera. But you shouldn't necessarily be sending every single raw message in its entirety, the terabytes and petabytes, into a premium storage system like Splunk or Datadog at all times, right? So from our perspective, edge is definitely a certain piece of it. Central and correlation is a piece of it. And we've always argued you should be doing both.
Yeah, so let's just double click on the edge, right? So when you talk about edge analytics, let's just say you get an alert, or let's say you get bunch of alerts, you get bunch of data. So how do you guys approach it? Is it more from reducing the data, or are you trying to maybe solve the alert as close to the edge as possible? Let's just say there's a benign alert coming out of an endpoint or an NDR, and there's enough evidence that this is benign, and you can just resolve it, get rid of it, right? Like is that an approach, or is the approach like there's some other vendors right now who are working on the efficiency, right? They're saying, okay, there's a lot of data that you're taking, let me just throw it out, let me just reduce it. Yeah, so just wondering like how your approach is.
I think this is a great example, right? So most of our customers, our ICP is large enterprise, right? They're the people that are spending a lot of money on these observability and security systems because they have a lot of data. They have terabytes and petabytes of data. So let's take a large organization. Let's take someone who has 50,000 employees, all with their own work laptops, their phones that have certain work apps on them, and you want to take more of this EDR or XDR approach, right? Now let's say there's something that happens within your network architecture or within your enterprise architecture that would cause something to happen on all these machines, right? Now, what you want is every single machine, you want that to have the intelligence to understand that there is an anomaly and something's happening. But what you also don't want is if you're using, let's say, PagerDuty or ServiceNow or some other ITSM system, you don't want 50,000 individual alerts to then go open up 50,000 individual tickets in those systems, right? Yeah. So although you want the edge intelligence, you do want a central component that can say, okay, I've now gotten these 50,000 very optimized alerts to let me know that there's these 50,000 anomalies on every single one of these systems. And you can consolidate that all down into, and again, this is an oversimplification, but it would be one single alert that says, of the 50,000 endpoints, 100% of them are experiencing this specific type of anomaly, right? So that's a very good example of where you want the edge intelligence, and you want to combine that with central correlation to give you the most sophisticated insights and alerts that you could ever have.
Great. And just based on your customer engagements, right? Let's just say on a scale like there's 100 alerts coming every day from your systems, and they would hit Splunk any single day. Like once they bring in Edge Delta, like roughly how much percentage do you think can be solved like in flight before maybe it hits Splunk, and then the processing starts behind Splunk?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that Edge Delta provides and telemetry pipelines provides is that end-to-end visibility, right? So you have to think about your data in stream, and that would be pre-index, and then you have to think about your data once it's been indexed or post-index, right? And what Edge Delta gives you is that end-to-end visibility into both sides of that equation. So you have to see to understand, and when you start to understand to say, oh, it's interesting that in that one part of our pipeline in stream, we're almost doubling the size of every single log because we're enriching it with additional data sets. That type of insight is super valuable to an organization if they say, okay, well, maybe we're getting a lot of value out of doubling the size of the message. Or maybe this is just something that one of our engineers did one day, and we didn't really realize that this was what was causing our index size to nearly double, right? So I think that's one really good example. The other thing that we see is we do have the ability to look at patterns and understand various different data sets. So if you were sending, let's say, a petabyte of data into Splunk, or even a terabyte of data into Splunk every single day, you don't really necessarily understand the full breakdown of what are the various different types of log messages in that terabyte. If you and I were going to go try to read a terabyte of data, a terabyte of logs, it would take us about 1,500 years to manually read over one terabyte of data. And some of our customers do petabytes of data a day, right? So it's almost inconceivable how big these data sets are.
Yep.
So the first thing we provide is really that insight into what is my data? Where is it being sourced? What is happening to it as it goes down this streaming process? And then finally, once it's indexed, what does it look like as well? To get that visibility, you can cut out 30, 40, 50. There's some customers that cut out 90% of their Splunk costs. Now, we would never promise that to every single customer. We say, like, look, let's take a look. But just being able to see it and have that visibility and have that understanding of your data is immensely valuable to a lot of teams, especially when you say, hey, it's not just one team. In a large enterprise, it might be 2 or 3 or 10 or 15 different teams that use these data sets. To be able to have pipelines to give you that full visibility is fairly invaluable to a lot of large enterprises.
Great. So I think you touched a bit on enriching the data, indexing it. Do you guys see yourself working with the downstream, like detection engineering? Like, how does that affect detection engineering? Like, do customers? I mean, what I heard is customers are very passionate and they like the detections that are working, right? Like, are they adopting, saying that, hey, look, instead of being very reactive, these guys are giving me a lot more enrichment, right away. So let me go and change my detections.
Well, I mean, I think absolutely. If you look at it, some of the large organizations we deal with, we get told from security teams, hey, sometimes these alerts are delayed by not only minutes or hours, but sometimes even a day or two, right? Yeah. So how do we expect our cybersecurity teams to be responding to, indicators of attack or compromise when, some of these alerts are coming a day late, right? And so I think it's really important to understand that this isn't just simply, hey, we have some cool anomaly detection algorithm that's slightly better or slightly next generation, or we use LLMs in a slightly better way. This has to be the foundation for your observability and security data strategy, right? If we think about it, if we go 5 or 10 years in the future, what are we going to get? We're going to get, let's say, OTel or OCSF data streams that enable standardization of data in stream. You're going to get a standardized format, whether that's, let's say, Glacier or some other format, to say, I want a standardized format for all of my data at rest. And then you're going to get a standardized query language, right? Which might be a PipeSQL or OTQL or some other query language. And you're going to get these 3 different components that are all standardized. And without that, you're going to constantly be incurring effectively these projects that are going to effectively turn into sunk cost in the long term if you don't have this standardization. So I think that's what's super powerful is once you have these standardized components, everything works flawlessly, efficiently, and in approximate real time, right? Real time can mean many things to many different people. But then you start to get a very cohesive approach and a cohesive strategy. And that foundation, then you can add these downstream systems, and you can add the downstream, whether it's some sort of new anomaly detection or whatever algorithm. And that's something that we do as well. But that standardization is core to what we believe in.
Great. And right now, like, what's the standard stack that you guys see in the customers, right? You know, like you have these collectors, you have Edge Delta, you have the cheap storage. Do you see like people bringing their own storage, or are they okay with you bringing your own storage? And then how does it work afterwards? Like, where are you seeing, like, are they sending the data back to Datadog and Splunk, and then like the detection guys, are they still sitting like behind Splunk, or do you see some of them coming more upstream, like reacting to what you guys are doing more in the pipeline to enrich data?
Well, you know, I think we are flattered because we see a lot of people reacting to what we're doing. But I think if you look at it, if you look at a standard modern enterprise, you're going to have a lot of different data sources, right? You might have network data over UDP or TCP. You might have Lambda functions. You might have, you know, Kubernetes on EKS, GKE, you know, whatever Kubernetes platform you want to use. And there's going to be push and pull, right? So you're going to need edge components. You're going to need central streaming components, endpoints similar to like a Splunk, you know, HEC endpoint. And so I think in a large enterprise, you're going to see that. Now, what we're typically seeing is, I will say we are starting to see large enterprises want to use their own on-prem, you know, quote unquote on-prem object storage on their own that they manage, right? And that's what we encourage. So we do have a hybrid architecture that does support both, you know, in the cloud and on-prem. And we are starting to see the large organizations say, you know, hey, look, you know, we have a great deal with AWS or Azure or Google, and we have this amazing object storage, and we want to be able to retain this data and use it for whatever purposes we want to use it. And I think that is a very healthy approach, and I think that's definitely a very scalable approach for the long term. And so I think that is what we're seeing in the market.
Okay, got it. Do you see any of the specialized data platform like Snowflake and Databricks, you know, because they offer a lot more processing analytics capability? Do you see them winning, or are people, you know, when they look for storage, are they just looking for cheap and deep and not so much on the analytics capabilities?
Well, I mean, I think both Snowflake, who we're partnered with, and Databricks, those are great solutions. But let's keep in mind, right? If you're batching certain data sets and you're using it for, let's say, BI or strategic insight into, you know, some sort of new go-to-market strategy, that is worlds apart from, you know, the millisecond or second response times that you need for observability and security. So I would say, you know, certainly there are similar concepts, right? Like I think the, you know, ELT or the ETL approach on more of the data analytics BI side is a similar concept to what we're doing with telemetry pipelines. But again, those two are still very worlds apart. And so you're always going to need platforms that are optimized for much more real-time streaming analytics. And then I think, you know, Databricks and Snowflake are phenomenal platforms for more of those batched data sets or batched queries where you're saying, hey, you know, if this query runs for 1 or 2 hours, well, I understand that it's going to run for a while because it's chugging through a lot of this data, and I don't really necessarily need it to alert me on something, right? So I think, you know, very good solutions for that. Even, for instance, if you look at object storage, right? There are 1,001 different ways to optimize you know, an analytics or an, you know, intelligence system to go work with data on S3 or some sort of object storage, right? So it's always that balance, right? The more real time you need it, if you need millisecond response times, well, you know, it might be quite expensive if you don't think about this in the right way, right? On the contrary, if something can be delayed by an hour or can be delayed by a day, it might be 10 or 100 times less expensive. So you do have to work with that balance of, you know, making sure that systems are super fast or making sure that systems are super efficient. And I do see Databricks and Snowflake and BigQuery and all the other types of, you know, engines that are meant for BI and ETL and ELT all of that is a very, very different world, even though a lot of the concepts are mirrored across both of those different ecosystems.
Yeah, since you mentioned BigQuery, let's just segue into Google, right? That's another platform I hear, they're grabbing a lot of attention in terms of like data flowing into Chronicle, right? So Chronicle started a long time back, and they have BigQuery, and now they have Mandiant and others, right? Just maybe like touching on the cloud guys, like maybe this like AWS and like Google, because AWS has less assets, but probably like Google has more assets. Like, how do you see the cloud guys playing in this space of telemetry pipeline?
Well, I think you have a fundamentally different approach. In a different lifetime, I was also an engineer in the Azure team in the early days of Azure. So I worked at Microsoft for about 6 years. But I would say like Microsoft takes a very different approach to this than someone like Google or AWS, right? I think Microsoft, if you look at, for instance, Azure monitoring, it's decent. It's a pretty good solution. I don't think you're going to go look at whether it's Chronicle or or CloudWatch, for instance, and say, oh, those solutions are just like Datadog. They're just as good, right? I think it's a different strategic approach. I think if you look at Amazon and Google, they don't necessarily say we're going to go compete with Datadog or Splunk or anything like that. And I think Microsoft takes a little bit more of a, I would say, aggressive approach to the market and say, hey, we actually want to go and do a little bit better. Maybe we won't be quite like the best SIMs out there or the best observability solutions out there, but we do want to be a lot better than our competitors when it comes to the big three. So I think, again, strategically, they do take different approaches. I don't see any of them really playing much in the telemetry pipeline space quite yet, but we'll see. We'll see what the future holds.
Great. Coming back to like the 600-pound gorilla, right? Like Splunk got acquired by Cisco. That was kind of a surprise, right? I feel it's like both good and bad, where, if they stayed public, they had to keep on, hitting the quarterly goals. But now, as a part of Cisco, they might have some opportunity to reinvent themselves, re-platform themselves. Do you see any of that as potentially good for the industry, or maybe like competitive to you guys?
Well, I think what we're always going to see change in the market, right? If we look at even Sumo Logic, where I was previously at, right? Francisco Partners, private equity, comes in, picks up Sumo Logic, and then goes and picks up New Relic, right?
Yeah.
If we look at, obviously, Splunk, $28 billion acquisition from Cisco. And so, I think there's a lot of flux in the space, for sure. There's a lot of movement. I think it is healthy. I think it opens up opportunity for people like Edge Delta, ourselves, to jump in and say, hey, look, where is there a huge gap in the market, and where can we go help our customers the best way that we can? And I think our focus has always been telemetry pipelines. We have always believed that you need to go as far upstream as possible to get the highest level of efficiency that you can get. And I don't realistically see any of these big players, especially Splunk, whether it was their original DSP product or ingest actions or anything that they try to do. It's just frankly not a big focus for them. We do love to partner with big companies like Splunk. And so we do have a partnership, whether it's Splunk or even you mentioned Snowflake. Those are the type of vendors that we want to partner with, because again, telemetry pipelines is about enabling you to get the most out of those platforms, right? We want you to get the most out of what you can get from Splunk. And so, I think it's great. I think there's always going to be movement in the space. I think this does open up a lot of opportunities for Splunk to try to reinvent themselves and try to do some unique things. Excited to grab my popcorn in many regards, and also excited to be a part of it in many other regards.
Great. So, let's touch on AI. Like, we have talked about for half an hour. We haven't touched AI, right? So now AI comes in. I like the fact, and I am bullish on AI. I feel like in a couple of years, every SOC will be done by AI, because AI is just very efficient. Like you mentioned, right? There are tons and tons of terabytes of this log files. A human cannot do it, no matter what systems you use. It's just very difficult. Like a pure raw like search just cannot do it. Like you need to have an intelligent system. So now with AI, I think we have that opportunity. But at the same time, I've seen some of this before. Like you have seen some of this before, like the U-bar generation, right? So that was it was based on Hadoop, like the big data, and now this is based on AI, right? So, but that U-bar didn't turn out to be huge, right? A lot of companies eventually got acquired or failed, and then some of them reinvented themselves into XDR and SIM. From your vantage point, when you see these pure play vendors popping up, just doing like pure AI based alerting, what's your point of view and how are you guys approaching that?
Well, I mean, I think to be fair, right, a lot of the user behavior analytics things did kind of get integrated into, the same concepts got integrated into a lot of the products. But I think from AI, the most interesting thing to me is no one is sitting here and saying Splunk is super inexpensive or Datadog is super inexpensive or, insert premium vendor here is very inexpensive. And yet, if you look at a per unit cost basis for LLMs and AI, although those costs are coming down pretty quickly, it's still like 1,000 times more expensive per unit cost of data than Splunk or Datadog, right? And so you have to be very thoughtful and proactive about, okay, what is that megabyte or kilobyte or gigabyte that I'm going to be feeding into the LLM and the OpenAI API compatible endpoint, because I can't just spend $1 billion a day with a B, $1 billion a day on AI. There's no way I can do that. And so I have to be very thoughtful and proactive about what are those small, very high value nuggets of data that I can go feed into those systems. That's where I think telemetry pipelines is actually super beneficial. We have this concept of continuous curation and inference, which is if our telemetry pipelines can be intelligent and identify those high value data sets, then you can trickle them in a very small amount, but in a very real-time manner into AI. And that's the only way you can do real-time AI at scale. So that is something where I think we're quite visionary and quite big from an innovation standpoint on that note. And that's where our on-call AI functionality, that's how that works, right? So our pipeline is able to identify certain patterns and anomalies within your data sets. Those are in real time, able to be fed to systems like Amazon's Bedrock Suite or OpenAI. And then from there, you get your immediate recommendation and suggestions for what you might want to do for a specific observability or security incident. And again, is it always going to be right? Maybe not. But if you're waking up at 3 a.m. and your eyes are adjusting, would you rather start at square one or would you rather start at square 5, where you might have a mixture of experts all telling you what they believe you should be doing? I would rather at least have some people on my team, whether they're AI bots or anyone else, and at least be able to make the decision myself as an engineer to say, okay, that's a bad suggestion, that's a potentially good suggestion, and be able to use that as a tool in my tool belt.
Yeah, so let's just segue into the alerts, right? As you mentioned, you guys can resolve some of these alerts. You can send it to the AI systems. So when you look at the current SOC, right, there's tier 1, just drinking all of the alerts from the firewalls, trying to figure out what to do. And some of the previous generation, like SOAR products, were targeted towards that, like, hey, how can I quickly get rid of some of the frequently occurring tickets? The tier 2 is deeper investigation. Tier 3 gets into forensic and others. Do you see a state where a lot of the tier 1, like the low-hanging fruit, where I think of like the SOAR being integrated in the data pipeline itself, like, hey, let me not even like wait for the data to hit the Splunk and then start my analysis. Like, if I already have this algorithms, let me just run it on my raw data.
Well, I mean, I think you're always going to need that correlation, and you're always going to need that intelligence you get by correlating data. I think, frankly, we're already seeing the lines very blurry between observability and security, right? I think a lot of the data sets are shared, and so a lot of the systems have to be shared. And I think we're going to start seeing a blurred line approach to these different tiers. I don't necessarily think that you need to have an extremely segregated tiering system. A lot of these things can be automated, and a lot of the intelligence that you get can be done within pipeline. But again, you're always going to need that correlation, right? So it might be, for instance, like a mechanism that says, okay, we're going to take all of your raw data and put it into object storage because, frankly, at the hundreds of terabytes or petabyte range, you can't afford to put all that in Splunk. But that being said, if there is an issue, if there is an anomaly, we want to go ahead and rehydrate those data sets back into Splunk so that when you get to that tier 2 or tier 3 investigation approach, you actually have the ability to correlate that data. But it can be very prescriptive. For instance, we might say, and again, this is where the UBA component might come back, right? It might say, hey, we're actually getting some anomalies and we can correlate to this specific user. Let's go rehydrate all the data that's related to that user so you have the full picture in Splunk, but you might only be putting in 1% or even 0.1% of that data. And so you're cutting out 99% of your cost or even 99.9% of your cost. But in any case where there is an anomaly or is an alert, there are some automated mechanisms on the back end to be able to hydrate that data and pull it back into Splunk. So that's where I see, it's not so much that there's a manual process going from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, but with these systems that can be end to end, that can say, okay, not only do we have a telemetry pipeline, but there's some kind of circular mechanisms that can go back in and have these be intelligent pipelines. I think it really minimizes the amount of manual effort required, and it really can speed up this process where if you get an IOC or an IOA, you are very well capable to be able to respond to that in a very quick manner.
Great. I think you mentioned IOC and threat intel. Like, how do you guys see threat intel? Like, is that something that you guys mix with your telemetry pipeline to enrich, or do you wait for the customers to use it downstream?
Well, and I think that's a great example of you have to mix it, right? So for a lot of our security customers, for instance, they're saying, hey, I have this lookup table, and I have some threat information in there, and yes, I could enrich that data once it hits our endpoint, right? Once it hits, let's say, Splunk or even an ingestion endpoint. But we might want to actually enrich that data at the edge and then make a decision about that data, whether or not it actually makes it into Splunk. All that data is already going to be going to our object storage anyways, but we want to actually distribute this lookup table down close to the data so that we can get those efficiencies, right? So I think absolutely it's something that we support for our customers. Absolutely something where, again, going back to that concept of central architecture versus edge architecture. And again, this is one of those things where for threat intelligence or lookup tables, you're going to need both. There are some things that are appropriate to be done in a distributed manner. There are some things that are appropriate to be done in a central manner. And we've always argued in our entire history that it needs to be both.
Great. Quickly, going back on the economics, right? Some of the, like you mentioned, you're working with large customers, so a lot of them are still not getting rid of their Splunk, and you have the data, what they call as the storage regulation, like you need to save the data like compliance for compliance reason for like 6 years, 7 years, right? How are customers like evaluating solutions like Edge Delta? Do they say that, hey, I'm spending like $10 or $20 million with Splunk? Like, how is it going to be different with Edge Delta? Like I'm trying to understand, is the conversation mainly about cost, or are they saying that, hey, this is like fundamentally better solution than what I had before, where I don't mind actually paying more than $20 million to get this thing in, or is it always like, hey, if you can shave some of the prices of Splunk, I might give some of that to you?
Well, I think, if we go back to, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago, I would say we were absolutely educating the market, right? So we would get in these calls with prospective customers, and they would say, I don't understand. I don't understand why I need something like this. And in the last couple of years, that has completely changed, right? So now we have prospects and customers coming to calls and saying, hey, now I know I need telemetry pipeline. I'm just trying to understand why Edge Delta is the best, right? So that conversation has very much shifted, and I think people are very educated on understanding architecturally why something like this is required. I think if you look at what customers are trying to get out of it, they understand the value of the standardization. I think we already know OTel and what value it provides. OCSF I think is a little bit less mature, but still, similar type of value that could provide. And I think people are looking for that standardization. Again, if I'm going to have all of my data in the cheapest storage I can get, which is S3 or an equivalent object storage, whether it's on-prem or you own your own hardware or whatever else, and I need a mechanism to be able to, in a standardized way, move my data around. And not only that, but if I want to go try, let's say I'm on Datadog today, and one of my developers comes out of the woodwork and says, hey, I want to go try Grafana, within seconds to minutes, I should be able to turn on a stream of data into Grafana. Same thing with SIMs, right? If I'm using a certain security analytics platform and I want to go try something else, I should have that flexibility. So I think that's the main thing that we try to provide is we're vendor agnostic. We believe that you should have the ability to have that flexibility in an open ecosystem where you say, I love Splunk. I think it's an amazing tool for security, but if I'm going to go try something else, I should have that optionality, and it should be fairly painless, right? And I think that's the exciting thing that we give to customers. It's not going to happen on day one. You're not going to deploy pipelines on day one and say, oh, now I can turn my Splunk off. Many of our customers, they usually keep their Splunk. There's usually a lot of use cases why you might want to keep your Splunk forever, right? But now you have that optionality. And some of the teams, they move on to, let's say, OpenSearch, or they move on to, Elastic, or they move on to, some other, log management tool. Or again, on the Datadog side, right? Some people might just turn off Datadog entirely and say, okay, I'm going to go try to do this myself, or I'm going to use Grafana, or I'm going to use some other tool out there. And so again, that optionality and flexibility and control, that's the number one thing that Pipelines provides. And I don't think people are necessarily thinking about it as closed-minded as they were 5 years ago. I think 5 years ago, it was all about Splunk cost reduction, right? It was just, look, I want everything that I could possibly have in Splunk. I just want to pay less for it, and that's the only way I'm thinking about it. I think the industry has matured, and I'm pretty excited to see how some of these enterprises are thinking about things in a more modern way.
Yeah. So let's just maybe spend another 5-10 minutes on LLMs, right? Like, how do you guys see LLMs? You have a lot of this off-the-shelf models. They're getting smarter and smarter. And you guys must have tried a few. Like, do you see you guys using like multiple LLMs, like, horses for courses, like, one upstream, another downstream, and, another one for like specialized tasks? Is that how you guys are seeing it? So
we already do. So currently our on-call AI feature already uses, you can sort of call it a mixture of experts, already uses multiple different models. The way that we're seeing this, absolutely, there's going to be much smaller models that there might be a reason to go push those down towards your data to the edge. But even before that, we're going to start seeing, and we're already getting customers ask for this, to say, okay, I want a dedicated model for myself that I can fine tune. With my own data sets, but again, I want to ensure that I have control over that model. You're also getting customers that are asking for a community model, right? So they're saying, hey, I want to be able to fine tune a community model, but also I want all the other customers to be able to fine tune that same model, and we can share that model and share that intelligence, right? So I think, for various different reasons, you're going to get customers that want both of those setups. For them, we want to be able to support that. So today, right now, we experiment with our own fine-tuning and our own training of a lot of these models with our own data sets, but for our customers, that is a capability that we want to be providing in the future.
Great. What other things are you excited about telemetry? Where do you see it's going?
I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but once we get to the point where you have telemetry pipelines that standardizes and enriches data on the way in, then you get one cohesive format, let's call it Iceberg or an equivalent, and then you get a standardized query language to query that data. I think that new foundation for data is going to be massive for the industry. And in fact, I don't even understand a future where if you're a large enterprise and you have a lot of data, you could ever not do that, right? I think you're just going to lose to competition if you don't have that data foundation. That's, to me, probably the most exciting thing that we're probably going to see in the next 3 to 5 years is that cohesive standardization. Like we all say, it all starts with pipelines. right? Your data starts with pipelines. You're going to have your centralized storage. You're going to have centralized, storage that's going to be able to be queried in a very standardized way. And that three-piece architecture is very exciting for me.
Great. Yeah, this was an amazing conversation. I learned a lot today. I think since you guys are like one of the original OGs in the data pipeline, I think the clarity that you have about data is amazing. So it was a pleasure chatting with you. So I will let you close it. Like, why would customers, choose Edge Delta? Why would a potential employee consider Edge Delta as a place to work for?
Well, Pramod, first of all, thank you for the time. I appreciate the opportunity. You can go to edgedelta.com and take a look at our website. We have a lot of information on there. But just to end as a closing note, I do believe that we are the most cohesive, end-to-end, comprehensive solution out there that gives you very, very good visibility into all of your data pre and post index. And that's something that I think we do best compared to anyone else in the world. So, Pramod, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the time here.
Yes, same here. Good luck.